Thank you very much for joining. So the title of this talk is Westernisation is not modernisation, and it's a reflection partly on my personal experiences in India. So what I'll be doing is I'll be telling you or giving you a glimpse into some of my experiences in India, and ultimately why that then motivated me to set up something called English Behen Kadilse, which is my name on social media, where I am championing Hinduism and India, promoting it, trying to explain it, ultimately with the idea that it's the world's greatest and most ancient civilization. And yet, at the same time, when I'm in India, I see so many efforts that are undermining it and weakening it. And it's just so sad and such a wasted opportunity for the world. So I'll be telling you about those personal experiences, why I then became English Behen Kadilse on social media. I'll then explain how my personal experiences are a sort of microcosm of a much larger operation with India, which I liken to being as self-colonization or colonization 2.0, but this time, done from within, done with internally. And I'll take the areas of health and education as some examples of this self-colonization. I'll discuss a bit about some of the sort of culprit facilitators of this self-colonization. One being, I feel, the long-term impacts of the British Raj on the Indian psyche. Ultimately, it gave rise to a sort of an inferiority complex. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll spend a bit more time talking about actually the English language and how that is damaging Bharat and leading to a self-colonization. And I'll be drawing on some academic studies that are supporting this idea that it is causing a self-colonization. And why does all this matter? So not only does it stop India from reaching its full potential, becoming a prosperous superpower that is a world leader in well-being and ultimately leading in science and technology, but it's also stopping the world from benefiting from all that ancient knowledge, tens of thousands of years of knowledge, of wisdom, of experience that has accumulated within Bharat, that the rest of the world could benefit from as well. So the title of the talk, as I said, is Westernization is not modernization. But another way to think about it is that if we were embracing Bharat, that is actually futurization, I feel. I feel that Bharat and people around the world embracing Bharatiya culture and traditions and practices, that is the future that the world needs. Without it, the world won't be sustainable or peaceful. So, and a good way to kind of summarize that, obviously, is that Sanatana Dharma, the key is in that Sanatana word, eternal. Sanatana Dharma is always modern. It was modern 10,000 years ago. It's modern today. It'll be modern in 10,000 years' time. It's always eternal. So it's modern, it's futuristic, it's all of that. So that's just a sort of introduction to what I'll be talking about for the next 35 minutes. In the meantime, if you wish to be asking any questions, please do type them into the comments. And then at the end of the session, I'll try my best to answer some of them. Okay? So, as I said, I'd start talking a bit about my personal experiences in India and how that has opened my eyes to self-colonization. So, just before I do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of context into who I am and why I'm particularly able to see this self-colonization, I feel. So, I am completely Western. I've always lived in the UK. My parents are both European down the generations as far as we know. And I knew nothing really about India or Hinduism until I met my husband. And at that time, I took my first visit to India. I came to understand what is Hinduism, and I absolutely fell in love with it. At the time, it was maybe on a bit of a superficial level, because at that time I had no understanding of the deeper meaning. So for me, it was just a deep immersion in color and food and music. But then over the years, I've come to understand India and Hinduism on a much deeper level, and have really grown to have such respect and appreciation for it. And particularly seen how aspects of the Western lifestyle are being taken to such extremes in India that it's completely undermining the true Bharatiya culture and traditions. Everything that is great about Bharat, it's completely undermining it. So a key example that I've personally experienced is that I'm trying to learn a bit of Hindi. I haven't got very far yet, but I am trying. And when we were in India a few years ago, I was trying to talk to my Indian family in Hindi, and they were getting very upset that I was trying to do this. And essentially they said they would rather not talk to me at all than talk to me in Hindi. Even though, I only see them maybe once a year when I come all the way from the UK, fly over to see them, they would rather not talk to me than talk to me in Hindi, because for them, Hindi has a very bad connotation. They felt that we should only be speaking English. So within the family as well, another example is there's a young girl there who is in India, in an Indian school, but she only knows English. She doesn't know any Indian language at all. When we meet with the neighbours in the society there, with my Indian family, they only talk in English. And the sorts of things they're talking about are how their grandchildren are attending English elocution lessons, or that their grandchildren are learning the piano or ballet or tennis or the violin. And I don't think I've ever heard any of them talking about their grandchildren learning Bharatanatyam or sitar or kushti, or any traditional Indian Bharatiya sports or arts. Sports and arts that Indians can really, really excel at, that have great meaning to them, that are almost like in their DNA. They're always trying to be copying Western sports and arts where other countries have an advantage in them. So it's not a level playing field. So another key example that happened actually just yesterday when I was talking to my Indian family on the phone was that this young girl that I mentioned before, in her Indian school, she's won an award, a Duke of Edinburgh award. So it's a UK award, even though she's in an Indian school. She's won a UK award for learning to cook Western cooking and learning a bit of piano. And yet things like learning sitar or learning Indian cooking, they were not eligible for helping you to get that award. And that just seems completely crazy to me, especially when I think Western food really is not great. Indian food is so much tastier. So this young girl, she doesn't know how to cook dal, a simple dal, but she knows how to cook some sophisticated Western cooking now. And that made her eligible for an award in an Indian school. And it's just, the mind for me boggles. And that actually brings me on to a nice next point, which is around just the eating habits that I've observed in my Indian family, and particularly at any parties, any gatherings they have. There's just so much non-veg. And quite often you hear these discussions about, who brought the most or who cooked the most mutton. And again, that's just not something that's like Western plus. Yes, in the West, certainly we eat a lot more non-veg than in India traditionally, even though the tide is really changing there. but it never became a competition who is cooking the most non-veg. But I observe this, I hear this happening in my own family, my Indian family, and the neighbours. And that's very sad. In the UK, actually, vegetarianism is really on the rise. In India, it's the complete opposite. The number, I think that I looked up a statistic, and they say that only about 20% of the Indian population now is vegetarian. The rest are eating non-veg. And another example, leading quite nicely on from that, is last year when I was in India, I attended a neighbourhood gathering of, it was a lecture essentially. They had invited a doctor, an Indian doctor, to come and talk about diet. And again, I was amazed that when I'm reading sections or learning about the Vedas, about the Puranas, there's so much, such a wealth of knowledge about what sort of diet you should eat, what you shouldn't eat, what's good for you, etc. And here they were listening to an Indian doctor talking about Western diets, these fad names like Atkin diets, all these fad names that you come across, and selling Western doctors' books on about these diets. And it was just so sad that, at home, I'm sure they'll have a copy of the Vedas just gathering dust that nobody is reading, containing such a wealth of indigenous knowledge. And yet they're paying money to a Western doctor in the US or somewhere for some fad diet that will disappear in 5 years' time. So the diet is not the only thing that I've observed Indians seeking sort of Western medical advice on. Another more recent thing is how to stay mentally resilient during COVID-19, during the pandemic. So while we in the UK, my husband and I, we have been tuning in to watch the Ramayana series, the Mahabharata series, and finding such mental strength from watching these. Our Indian family have been watching Zoom lectures given by Western doctors about what psychological techniques to use to stay mentally strong. And they've obviously not proved very effective because they're really struggling. They're struggling mentally to cope with the lockdown, and we're completely fine. And part of this comes in from the fact that Western psychology, it's been developed within the Western framework. And the Western framework is one of materialism. And I'll be talking much more about that later. But ultimately, materialism is very bad for your mental health. Within my family, I see them often discussing, who's bought the most expensive sari, these sort of things, objects, talking about expensive objects. And there are academic papers out there, and I'll talk more about them later, showing that the more you identify your self-worth with materialism, with objects, with status, the poorer your mental health, the less able you are to cope in adversity or even in minor disappointments. And as I mentioned earlier, my husband and I, we've been watching Ramayana and Mahabharata. At the same time, we know within our Indian friends and family that they've instead been watching things like Big Boss or a singing competition where I actually saw one of these with them a few years ago where Akshay Kumar, I couldn't believe it, he came onto the centre of the stage where there was a toilet on the centre of the stage and he was making some joke about sitting on a toilet. I mean, it's just completely such crass entertainment. And it's just lowering the level of consciousness across the whole of Bharat when there is such a wealth of knowledge available in the ancient scriptures. Why are you spending your time watching these terrible things on TV? And then a final thing just to mention about my personal experiences within India that kind of feed into this self-colonization is that people are not aware of the itihasas anymore. And in fact, they're rejecting them. So like Diwali is a key case in point where, the traditions of crackers and everything has been really suppressed. And yet there's been such a glorification of, for example, Christmas, which, you know, comes with a massive, massive carbon footprint. You know, those plastic trees that Indians are buying now, you know, the carbon footprint that was involved in creating these plastic trees is massive. And so there's this completely unfair comparison between the Hindu traditions and the other religious traditions, and how they are being glorified. And I see this trickling down on a daily basis. And then ultimately it comes down to very clever marketing of missionaries, essentially. So we daily get messages from family with like biblical, you know, sections from the Bible, or their profile pic will be a picture of them hugging an angel, for example. Just very biblical imagery and messages constantly bombarding Indians, and subconsciously, you know, they are being converted, but ultimately they are complicit in this. They are allowing it to happen. They are lapping it up. And that's something that Indians really need to wake up to and just see what is happening at face value and stop embracing it. In fact, they should be rejecting that. Okay, so all of these experiences I have seen during my trips to India, and it was on one trip I remember particularly well, where we were flying home from Bharat on the airplane. It was a domestic flight within Bharat on the way home to the UK, and they were playing Jingle Bells in the middle of January on the plane. Now, in the UK, I've never heard Jingle Bells on a plane, especially not like 2-3 weeks after Christmas has ended and the day before in Hindu festivals are beginning to come up, like Lori. It was literally the day before Lori. And I thought, you know, this really has to stop. And so that is why I set up English Behen Kadilse on social media. So I'm very active on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, creating videos and other content, just promoting Hinduism and India, and helping Indians and Hindus particularly to feel proud of themselves and to realize they don't need to ape the West. Ultimately, as I said before, Sanatana Dharma is eternal. It's going to put you in good stead today and in the future. This is what we should be embracing. So what is the main problem with Indians not embracing Sanatana Dharma, but instead embracing Westernisation? Well, the first very immediate problem is that it always relegates Indians to being second-rate copycats. And as a Westerner, I can see very clearly the desperate attempts that Indians go to almost go to Western plus, to become Western extreme. And it becomes actually almost like distasteful, because they're trying so desperately to be Western that they really take it to the extreme. So, for example, when I saw a clip, I couldn't watch very much, but a little clip of Big Boss in India last year, I was shocked that the challenge for that episode was watching these young people making out with each other in a swimming pool and judging who was being the most, you know, making out the best in the swimming pool. I just couldn't believe it, that upper middle class Indians are enjoying this. You know, they would spend hours watching this. Now, things like Big Boss, that has come from the Western world. In the UK, for example, it's basically Big Brother that's been here for a few years. But the key thing is that it's a very specific type of person in the UK that watches that kind of thing. So in the UK, we have, you know, classes of people, from working lower class to upper class, and it is the people that you don't really aspire to become who watch things like Big Brother, who are football fans, who drink a lot of alcohol, who watch music videos with very scantily clad women. You know, that's not the kind of people that most British people aspire to become. And yet in India, you see upper middle class people aspiring to this, to the very worst bit of the Western society, of Western culture. And trying, as I said, like going to the extra degree to do it even more, to be even more Western. And unfortunately, it's not just limited then to the upper middle class in India, because then the lower, the maids, for example, the drivers who are aspiring to be the upper middle class Indian, who are aspiring for their children to be highly educated, to do well, to live in a nice bungalow, they are looking up to the people that they are working for, and then they are trying to adopt these practices, these things as well. So last year I asked our family maid in India, what's her favorite food? And she said McDonald's. And I thought, how terrible, because I I love Indian food so much. It's so tasty. Why on earth would you want some burger in an orange bun? Why on earth would you want to eat that when there's such tasty food available? So that's a real problem, because it's then it's infiltrating all of Indian society. And ultimately, people don't realize that imitation is not viewed as a strength. People view imitation as a weakness, actually. People view being strong to yourself, being true to yourself, that is a strength. That is something that people respect. So actually the West would really respect India much more if India really embraced being Indian, being Bharatiya, rather than being a copycat of them. Why would they respect that? They would almost, find that humorous. And ultimately, all of this is just degrading India. It's stopping the country from reaching its full potential, because it can never be a better Western country than the West. It can only be the best Bharatiya. So why not then embrace being Bharatiya and make the most of it? And ultimately, any language, any culture emerges from within a country. It evolves within a country over generations, over years and years and years, because it is optimized for that geography, for that type of person living there, for that temperament of person. So that just goes back to the fact that Indians will be best at being Indians. Their culture is optimized for them, so they should really embrace it. And as I mentioned earlier, not only are they doing themselves a disservice, and meaning that India at the moment cannot become a superpower because it's always being an inferior copycat, but it's stopping the West from being able to realize the amazing potential of the Bharatiya culture, traditions, practices, so that they might begin to absorb some of these things. I mean, ultimately, India, as I said earlier, has tens of thousands of years of knowledge built up that the West could make use of. And at the moment, because it's complete, when it looks at India, it sees a country that is, in many areas still in poverty, where the obesity levels are very high, where mental health illness is, really rocketing up. So they, of course, would wonder, why on earth should we be saying to follow how Indians have been living, the Bharatiya way? But that's because they don't realize that how Indians are living today is not Bharatiya culture. If Westerners are to realize that there is so much value in the Bharatiya culture, Indians need to embrace their culture and show the world just how good it is for human health, how good it is for scientific discoveries. Then the West will really wake up, take notice, and start adopting some of these things for the benefit of the whole world. And at the moment, there's just no way that the West would be able to discover the greatness of Bharatiya culture and knowledge. If you look at the statistics in the UK, for example, mental health problems are really rocketing up. It's going to be a real problem for the UK in the future. 1/6 of the population are on antidepressants at any one time in the UK. So they really need to transform themselves. India has all the answers, but at the moment there's no way for the West to appreciate that because Indians themselves aren't embracing it and making it known. So there are two vehicles I see driving this colonialization 2.0. The first is an inferiority complex, and the second is the English language. And there is a relationship between the two, no doubt. So just a little bit about the inferiority complex. So as you all know, India has been subjected to like 800, nearly 1,000 years of invasions, where it was dangerous to say, I am a Hindu. It was dangerous to do Hindu practices, to do puja, for example. And then under the British Raj, it was systematically illegal. It was, if you were singing Vande Mataram, it could end you in jail. If you want to do Kalari Payatu, it was illegal. It could put you in jail. So there was this constant fear of being proud to be Hindu, of being proud to be Indian. And so people didn't talk about it. And in fact, over time, they began to think, oh, actually, maybe the British were correct. They were brainwashed into thinking the British were correct over hundreds and hundreds of years of this constant messaging that you are inferior, that, everything worth discovering has been discovered in the West, that the only method for evaluating the value of anything is the Western way of attributing value to something, that the Bharatiya way of seeing something as valuable is invaluable in itself. So over time, Indians, they began to think this way. So they developed an inferiority complex. Now, the English language, there are obviously some very sinister and very obvious ways in which the English language is undermining India, Hinduism, and promoting colonization. So an example is, for example, the words like using the words cash cow or using the words RIP, rest in peace. These are completely adharmic words. If you are wishing someone to rest in peace when they die, you are actually saying, I don't want you to get sadgati. I don't want you to progress towards moksha. It's actually a very bad thing to be saying. You should be wishing them, Om Shanti, wishing they get sadgati. You want them to be progressing towards moksha. Things like cash cow, that's quite obvious. You're attributing Gaumata to being something that you consume, essentially. It's a materialistic thing. And that is not at all consistent with the Dharmic way of thinking with Hinduism. So please stop using these words. And then in my own experience, trying to learn a bit of Hindi, it's become very obvious that the way in which you speak, or the language that you speak, it does change the way you think. So for example, the word to have in English, I've come to realize there is no sort of literal translation for that in Hindi. And I think that's probably because in Hinduism, you don't own anything. Nothing is yours. You are here on this earth temporarily in this body. You don't own anything. So if you're constantly thinking, I have this, I have that, you're undermining the dharmic way of thinking, the Hindu way of thinking. And I recently came across a really interesting study by a group in the US, professor from University of Ohio and University of New York. The lead author's name is Thibbodo, published a paper in 2016, basically showing the results of a study in India, showing that speaking English in informal situations is changing the way that you are thinking. And ultimately, it's changing India's approach to socio-political matters. So what they did in this study is they surveyed thousands of Indians who then ranked themselves on how fluent they were in English and also how often and in what situations they are speaking English. And they found that people who are speaking English just in very formal situations, for example, just in work meetings, they have a very different association between certain words and their political and socio-political viewpoints than people, Indians, who talk English in all sorts of situations. So with their family, with their friends, they watch English, films, for example. So as an example, a concrete example of what they did in this study, they gave a word such as crime, and they then gave a metaphor for the word such as virus or beast. And they then asked the person to say, which of those words did they most associate with the word crime? So do they think of crime being more of a virus in society, or do they see it more as a beast of society? And they found that people who then subsequently thought the solution to reducing crime was to have more police patrolling, they associated the word crime with either beast or virus in a very different way to people who thought the solution to reducing crime was to have educational reform or economic reform. And from this, they found a statistically significant difference in people who only use English in formal situations, so for example in a work meeting, compared to people who use it all the time at home with their friends, their families, when they're watching the TV. Another example was, for example, the word education, whether somebody would associate the word education with garden, as in you're culturing somebody's education, or if they more associate the word education with the word industry, that education is like an industry. You are churning children out of school. So that was another example used that shows that people who are, or Indians who are speaking English only in formal situations or all the time, they viewed the word education differently. They were more likely to see it as an industry than as a garden. Really, really interesting. And so this study went on to say that they limited this just to studying the impacts of English language on Indians' views on sociopolitics. But actually, they've done other studies in other cultures and countries and found that this also impacts on somebody's mental health, on their emotions, and then on their perceptions of time. So, really fundamental things to how we see the world. Language, particularly speaking English in India, is really shaping how Indians are seeing the world, seeing themselves, shaping the Indian laws. And ultimately, that's potentially very dangerous because, as I said earlier, that India needs to be true to itself. That is how it will be the best India, because the traditional Indian languages have evolved for that geography, for that type of person living in India, for that type of temperament of person. So then to be importing laws, importing ways on seeing time, importing ways on seeing mental health through the language you are using, it's incredibly dangerous. So you only have to look at some other countries to know that India really hasn't, speaking English and keep maintaining in the British ways of the British frameworks for law, for education, really has not done India any good. We're 72, 73 years after independence, and compared to other countries who at that time, were really quite destroyed, India really hasn't progressed as far as well as it could have. You only have to look at, for example, Germany after the Second World War. It was really destroyed, and yet they embraced the German language, and they are a world leader in so many different fields, in science, in technology. They're basically bailing out all of Europe. Another example is Japan after the Second World War. They were pretty much destroyed, but they stayed true to the Japanese language. And again, they're doing amazing things. So the approach that India has taken to maintaining this self-colonized state of still using English, of still adopting the British education system, it really has not done it any favors at all. So I'll now go on to a few examples of how colonization 2.0 is really impacting on the health and well-being of Indians today. So I've mentioned already mental health a few times, and I'm doing that deliberately because in India, the statistic is that mental health issues have basically doubled in one generation, in almost like 20 years. The impact of mental health as a proportion of all health issues has doubled. Now that is a staggering statistic. And granted, actually, the mental health need or issue in India is still much lower than in the West. As I said, in the West, 1/6, or in the UK, 1/6 of people are on antidepressants at any one time. But it's not going to take long for India to be comparable to that if it continues on its trajectory. And it's such a shame because there is so much knowledge and wisdom within the ancient scriptures, ancient Hindu scriptures, that really are the best defense to mental health issues. There is another study that I'll just mention now by an author called Eckersley, published again in 2016, called Is Modern Western Culture a Health Hazard? And in that paper, he pulls in statistics from various clinical trials, etc., showing that actually the Western mindset, the Western way of looking at the world, is the worst for mental health because it really encourages materialism and independence. And I'll just explain what I mean by independence there. So in the West, there was a need for more independent thinking, is what the West feels. Because in the past, when you are operating under the Christian church, you are constantly being suppressed by the Ten Commandments and by this dogma of the priest, saying you have to live your life in a certain way, otherwise you're going to hell. You have to, believe in Jesus and do certain things so that you don't go to hell for all eternity. So there was a desperate need in the West to be liberated from all that dogma. Now that has been happening, thankfully, but the problem is in the West, they have confused being able to think for yourself, which is autonomy, with needing to think of yourself, which is like independence, only thinking about yourself, what you want, and not being influenced by anyone else, not being influenced by any, for example, a moral framework. And that has been very damaging to the West's mental health, because then all the pressure of being successful, of living a good life falls on you. You are completely isolated from your friends, from your family, from your culture, because everything is then determined by you. It's almost become like a job to be independent rather than a given that you can think autonomously. And that you're thinking of yourself has ultimately really encouraged this very commercial, consumeristic, materialistic society where, and the study has shown that the more you are influenced by advertising, the more of a materialistic viewpoint you have or attitude you have, and therefore the less able you are to cope in adversity or even in minor disappointments. And the study makes the point that actually the Oriental or the Eastern way of thinking is a much, much healthier way of thinking, where you are part of a system. You're not independent. You can think for yourself. And in fact, it's encouraged to think for yourself, to be constantly questioning. That ultimately is Sanatana Dharma. It really encourages questioning. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, it's just a series of questions and answers. It really encourages questioning. But it's questioning within a framework where you are part of nature. You are not separate from it. You are part of Brahman, essentially. You are all connected to each other, connected to other people, connected to nature, connected to animals. You are connected. And that is actually, the study concludes, the best defense you can have against mental health. But sadly, in India, Indians are completely forgetting this. And as I said, depression is just skyrocketing. I see it within my own Indian family and friends, Indian friends and family. It's really, really sad. And ultimately, your mental health, and particularly that move towards having a very materialistic view of the world, is impacting on physical health as well. So all that bombarding of commercials, of adverts, of materialism, is leading to high rates of obesity. People are, eating McDonald's instead of eating dal. So 1/3, in some areas of India, 1/3 of the population is now obese. So it's not quite at, the levels of the US, where it's roughly 50% in some areas are obese, but it's not far behind. And it's vastly, vastly worse in urban areas than in the rural areas. So it's a real, real problem, because ultimately it's actually a mental illness that's causing this physical illness. So the second and final example I want to give of how self-colonization is really, damaging Indians today is the education system. So, and ultimately it's really, in the current education system in India is really perpetuating this inferiority complex, because it's promoting this Judeo-Christian mindset and also actually an Islamic mindset. It's glorifying the Mughal rulers, who only ruled for a very short period of India's history, but it glorifies them to making it seem as if they ruled India for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that's just not true at all. The true Hindu Indian history is completely suppressed. Children aren't learning about Raja Chola and how his conquests over to Thailand. Ultimately that's why the Thai king today, he's called Rama the 10th. And most Indians, they won't know this, and that's really, really sad that they don't appreciate just how vast and great their civilization was. And it's because the history lessons in India and the Indian schools are just incorrect. And even the science and the maths that children are taught in Indian schools are just incorrect again. I'm not saying actually like the maths and science themselves, but who they are attributed to. They're attributed to Kepler or Newton or Euler, when actually we know now that they were discovered in Bharat hundreds, if not thousands of years ago by Brahmagupta or other, Indian mathematicians and scientists. And it's just so sad to see then Indians not appreciating just how I definitely see this, how they can be the world leaders in science and technology in future. I really believe that. Not only has history shown that they're very, very capable, but ultimately that the Hindu way of thinking, the Hindu appreciation for consciousness, of dharma, of karma, ultimately this is what is going to allow Indians to be leading the world in science and technology in the future. You only have to look in, the Mahabharata or the Ramayana to know that the ancient Hindus, they had such advanced technology at their hands that even today we probably we don't have. Wouldn't it be wonderful to think of a world in future where India helps the world to rediscover these technologies and this science? I find it incredibly exciting to imagine this world. So I think I'd probably, give some good examples of the ways in which India, and particularly the Bharatiya culture, Hindu way of thinking, can really, be such a strength to future-proofing the world, to allowing the world to have a future. If things continue as they are, ultimately the world is not sustainable. The continual materialism, the consumption of the world's natural resources, the growing rates of mental illnesses, of obesity, all of these things are taking us to a place where humanity just cannot function, and the world is in a terrible state and cannot, support us anymore. And not just humanity, but all of life. That is the future we have if things continue on this very Western vein. What the world really needs is to embrace Bharatiya culture. And for that to happen, Indians first need to embrace it. They need to reject the constant advertising from the West. They need to reject aping the West. They need to transform their education system. They need to transform the way they approach their attitudes to health, so that they get greatest benefit, and then they can show the world, and the rest of the world can look up at them and think, wow, how is India doing this? So that they then have their voyage of discovery to understand the Bharatiya culture, the knowledge, the wisdom, for the betterment of the whole world. So I think that is probably a good point to end. I hope you really enjoyed that. I see there have been some questions coming in, so I'll just tackle a couple of them. There's one question here. So what is the main reason behind the inferiority complex? Is this related to Indians moving away from spirituality? So I think the inferiority complex is very multifold. It's very multifaceted, and it's been built up over hundreds of years, over generations, and that is all the more reason why it's being difficult to undo. So it's partly because in the past it was dangerous to speak out as a Hindu, to do Hindu practices, because of the Mughal leaders, and then under the British Raj, you could be killed, essentially. And so not only did Indians and Hindus shy away from feeling proud about themselves and doing the Hindu practices, but they actually also stopped questioning others. So that is another reason why Indians and Hindus, they are so reluctant, I find, to ask questions about Christians or Islam, really pushing them to understand, to be questioning them. Why are you saying that I'm going to hell? There is no basis for this. I don't believe you. They're shy to say these things, to really tackle them head on. So I feel that's partly because of that, the main reason is, for hundreds of years, it was dangerous to say these things. And Indians haven't shed that psyche, unfortunately. And then it's after independence came, there was a poor choice in leaders, unfortunately. The leaders themselves were products of the British education system, and they then instilled the British Raj attitudes and infrastructure towards civil service, towards education, and they then became sort of the new colonizers. The only difference was, instead of being, the white British people enforcing these laws and teaching this education system, it was now Indians teaching this British way. So there was a poor choice of leader. And ultimately, that political party stayed in power for such a long time, and a political party that thrived on a Western way of thinking, because ultimately a dynasty relies really on things like blind belief, on things like materialism, getting support from international quarters. So only recently, when the BJP has come in, has there been an opportunity for Indians to really recognize their own great self again. Ultimately, a lot more needs to be done. BJP is a step but we need a lot more to be done to really be promoting, pushing the Hindu agenda, transforming the Indian education system. I think that will have a massive impact on getting rid of that inferiority complex, to help children to realize that, all those scientific and technological discoveries were made by Brahmagupta and, the other ancient, Shusrata in surgery, all these fantastic people that children are just completely unaware of. And they think anything that's been worth discovering was discovered in the West. So if the education system were reformed, I think that would make a massive difference. And also cracking down on the ability of the West to be constantly bombarding India with commercials for their products. And ultimately, they are the inferior products. Whenever I go to India, I'm shocked when I have a glass of orange juice. It's just disgusting. It really is. But I love a glass of orange juice here in the UK. And that's because the Western brands, the big Western brands, they see India as this big market they can make lots of money on, but also it's a market that's very cost constrained and with less regulation. So they really exploit it. They, are shipping the worst products into India, flogging it off at a really low price. And unfortunately, Indians are lapping it up. And that then is leading to the obesity and everything that I've just been describing. So there needs to be much stronger sort of policing, I feel, of the ability for the West to be influencing India, particularly the worst of the West to be influencing India. Okay, another question. Thank you for that question. That was excellent. So another question here. How can Indian values be revived? So I see a key way to this certainly being the education system, as I've just described, but it's also the responsibility of every Indian, particularly every Indian parent. So when I was first learning a little bit, right at the beginning, about India and Hinduism, I was reading the Amar Chitrakatha comics, the ones on the Itihases, on Mahabharat and Lord Shiva. And that was an excellent introduction to me of a very accessible introduction to India and Hinduism. Because ultimately, Hinduism, one of the beautiful things about Hinduism is that it's so rich, it's so deep, that if you are first being introduced to it, you can feel a bit overwhelmed. So things like the Amar Chitrakatha comics are an excellent way to just make that stepping stone to realize that richness and that deepness. And that I'm talking about that to me as an adult learning about Hinduism and India at the first time. But that's also true for children. And that's why I think Indian parents really need to be using things like the Amar Chitrakatha comics to be introducing their children to true Indian Bharatiya history, itihases, traditions, culture, rather than allowing them to be so sucked in to watching things like Big Boss and other terrible Western imports. So it's a real responsibility on Indian parents, I feel, to be imbibing strong beliefs in their children. And things like, considering sending them to a Gurukul. If, educational reform isn't going to happen anytime soon, then you do consider this and ultimately having a role in setting up more Gurukuls. As we know, children are real sponges. It's those first few years are there that you have a real opportunity to be shaping the way they see the world, that then will perpetuate throughout the rest of their life. That is the optimal time to be reviving Hinduism within a person. It's when they're a child. And there aren't many Gurukuls out there. So I do feel very strongly that there needs to be a concerted effort to be setting up more Gurukuls that are teaching the correct history of India, that are teaching dharmic aspects of life, that are giving a real rounded education from sports through to science and using the latest technology. I find it amazing that my Indian family, they keep saying that we're really old-fashioned, that they are modern. And that's just not true at all. Being Hindu, being Bharatiya does not mean you're not modern. As I said earlier, Sanatana Dharma is eternal. It absolutely means you embrace the latest technology. But you, as I said, you embrace Sanatana Dharma. It's done in an eternal framework. It's modern 10,000 years ago. It's modern in 10,000 years. So we need to be teaching, particularly our children, these things, I feel. Another question here. So thank you again for that. Really excellent question. Another question here. How do we control missionaries who are targeting poor people? Very, very good question. So there are some key things that we can all be doing to be undermining the efforts of the missionaries. So just within ourselves, we can stop saying things like all religions are the same, because they're not. The Dharmic religions, Hinduism is the key example here. We believe in karma, in reincarnation, in moksha. These are all things that Christians say will send you to hell. So they cannot be one and the same religion. They're completely incompatible. So we must stop saying that all religions are the same, because Christians then use that as a tool, to tell people, well, you're already part of our religion anyway, because all religions are the same. So why don't you then just, add Jesus to to be your Ishtadev as well as Hanumanji? And then before you know it, they say, okay, they'll really put Hanumanji down until all that's left is Jesus. And then, you've got a fully converted person. And I did some research a few weeks ago, maybe even a few months ago now, surfing different missionary websites, different church websites, and they list these steps to converting a Hindu down. And that is exactly their method. That they'll say, all religions are the same. So really, you're already a bit of a Christian anyway. Why not add Jesus as your Ishtadev as well as your other Ishtadevs, the other devs that you are doing puja to? And over time, they'll just tell you to be getting rid of of Hanumanji, of Lakshmi, until there's only Jesus left. That is their tactic. So please stop saying all religions are the same. Another thing we can all stop doing is to be, as I mentioned earlier, giving our children a real strong sense of Hindu identity, really having strong belief in the itihas, in dharma, and make them aware of all the inconsistencies that exist within Christianity. And there are so many. So for example, that before Jesus arrived, potentially he arrived, possibly, nobody can actually prove that, obviously, 2,000 years ago, everybody who was born before then must have gone to hell, because Jesus hadn't yet come to be able for them to be Christians. And ultimately, unless you worship Jesus, you go to hell. That's what Christians believe. So all those billions of people who lived before Jesus arrived 2,000 years ago, that meant they all went to hell because Jesus hadn't arrived yet. And equally, even after Jesus had arrived, people living, on a remote island somewhere who had no opportunity to learn about Jesus, again, they automatically would go to hell, a Christian would say. So that's one thing that just does not make sense, does it now? Another is that somebody can be a very devout Christian, do their prayers every day, and seek confessions if they do anything wrong. As long as they seek confession and say, well, I shouldn't have done that, then that redeems them for any ill that they did, any evil that they did. So someone like Hitler, a Christian would say, actually, he's probably in heaven because he said his prayers every day. Apparently, he repented before he committed suicide. So ultimately, he would have gone to heaven, whereas those 6 million Jews that he gassed to death, because they don't believe in Jesus, they would have gone to hell, even though many of them were obviously very benevolent, very wonderful people. Because they didn't believe in Jesus, they would have gone to hell. So there are these different things that you can really challenge Christians on that perhaps will even make them question their own faith. A few other examples I can give you off the top of my head that, humanity or even the world only came into existence 6,000 years ago, Christians, or the Bible says. There's plenty of evidence to say that, the world has been in existence for more than 6,000 years. The Vedas, they correctly predict that the universe has been around for billions of years. They got that order of magnitude correct. And yet Christians just 2,000 years ago, they thought it was only 6,000 years old. That's quite a big difference. So there are just so many opportunities to perhaps even make Christians question their own faith. So please feel my guest in trying to make Christians realize this. Another question here. How do you define Sanatana Dharma in one word? Okay, I think actually the answer to this question is actually within the word Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana, it's eternal. It's the way. It's the way for life 10,000 years ago, today, in 10,000 years' time. It is eternal. There are so many things within the Bible that just are very much, you can tell, were written like 2,000 years ago or so. So things like attitudes towards homosexuality, they are very antiquated ideas that the modern world just does not embrace anymore. So it's very clear that the Bible was of a time, it was of 2,000 years ago. Another little thing to mention is that it's very clear that the Bible was written at least a couple of hundred years after Jesus. Nobody who actually ever met Jesus wrote the Bible. So that's why there's another reason there's so many inconsistencies between the different authors. So between the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, there's loads of inconsistencies. But by the by, whereas Sanatana Dharma, it was divinely gifted to individuals, to rishis who did severe tapas, sincere tapas for thousands of years, that they could understand the truth of the universe, the truth that is eternal. Truth is eternal. So for me, one word that sums up Sanatana Dharma is eternal. Okay, another question here. By the way, that was a fantastic question. I hope it'd be interesting to see what other people think. Perhaps you could all comment. What is the one word you would use to sum up Sanatana Dharma? I find that really interesting. Okay, another question. How does the Bharatiya way of thinking of Hinduism help to handle COVID? Help with handling COVID. So as I mentioned earlier, I think the Hindu way of understanding health and particularly mental health is the best mechanism, the best protective force out there for coping during the lockdown. Because ultimately, Hinduism, it encourages internal reflection, introspection, internal growth. Whereas in the West, that materialistic way of thinking, it encourages external goals, putting your value on external, on objects, on status, things that are beyond your control. So when you are putting your value on external things, when those external things lose value in the pandemic, either because you can't reach them, you literally can't get to buy an object, or that object's value has decreased because, we're likely heading into recession, certainly in the UK, or then your whole world comes crashing down essentially as a Westerner. Whereas if you have a dharmic way of thinking, you are always protected because your strength comes from within, your value comes from within. You realize that actually we're all Brahmin, and that's all that matters actually. So I say, yes, that's actually the biggest opportunity that Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma has for helping the world to cope with COVID-19. There's also the practical, the physical aspects of, the Hindu culture, saying namaste, not touching, not kissing each other's cheeks, all these practical things that are very useful for stopping yourself from getting COVID in the first place, or how in Hinduism, cleanliness, hygiene are very, very valued. You'd be shocked to hear that actually in the West, I know many people who only shower maybe, once a week. It's not seen that odd, that's normal. And yet in India, showering at least once a day everyone does that. Of course you do. When you enter the house coming from outside, you take your shoes off, you change your clothes. These are all things that are really standing India in good stead during the pandemic, that in the West are completely alien to us, actually, and people are really struggling with it. So I think in many ways, Bharatiya culture, Hinduism, has really helped India during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the world is, actually looking towards or adopting some of these practices itself. Were there any other questions? No? So I'll just give you literally 20 more seconds. Anyone else wants to ask a final question before we finish? Otherwise, I'll just be thanking you all very much for listening in. I hope you found that useful. If you do have any more questions, please just write them below, and I'll do my best to go back and answer them. And otherwise, please do share the video with your friends and family, and ultimately, actually, please also my my Twitter page, my YouTube channel, my Facebook page, English Behen Ka Dil Se. I try my best to promote India and Hinduism in videos and in tweets, etc. So I hope you find them really useful, interesting. So thank you everyone. Bahut dhanyavad. Jai Shri Ram.